Human beings throughout history have always been willing to fight for what they believe is right. Many times, those battles are fought with an amount of caution so as to not harm innocent people, trying to maintain some amount of civility while still engaging in battle. Sometimes, though, innocent civilians are caught in the crossfire. During the latter half of the 20th century, Northern Ireland was effectively in a state of civil war as both the Protestant and Catholic inhabitants of the country fought over their desire to be part of or separate from the United Kingdom. But while most of the battle took place in cities such as Belfast, it would from time to time spill out over other locations in mainland UK as well. It was one of those situations that led to the deaths of 21 people and the injury of 182. The Troubles, as they would become known, began in 1969 when the Provisional Irish Republican Army, a paramilitary force set on uniting both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland as a single independent nation free from British rule, started a campaign of violence against anyone who opposed them. But while they certainly had their supporters amongst those who wanted to see their homeland return to its former glory, for most people in the Republic of Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales at the time, they were viewed as little more than a terrorist organization. That was because the methods they were using to try and attain liberation for Northern Ireland were incredibly deadly and often revolved around planting bombs in Protestant-heavy civilian locations. Of course, in their minds, those actions were necessary as they served the dual purpose of both driving said Protestants out of the country and creating an atmosphere of fear amongst the general population, which they hoped would lead to the UK government being pressured into caving to their demands. Unfortunately, though, as the early years of the Troubles went on, it became clearer and clearer that the UK Prime Minister Edward Heath had no intentions of bending the knee to a terrorist organization. Because of that, by 1973 the IRA felt forced to take things to the next level by extending the range of their attacks to the British mainland. Would that create a situation where the people of England, Scotland, and Wales felt so scared for their lives they'd beg their government to let Ireland finally be liberated? No, quite the opposite. In fact, after things reached a point where, in early 1974, mainland Britain was seeing an average of one attack every 3 days, support for the IRA and their cause reached an all-time low in the UK. Sure, the organization claimed they had no intention of hurting any innocents and that they would always try to get civilians out of harm's way whenever they planted a bomb by calling it in ahead of time, but that didn't always happen. Because of that, countless innocent people ended up losing their lives as a result of a conflict that had nothing to do with them. And few parts of the UK felt the effects of that more than the north of England, as many of the attacks seemed to be concentrated there. On November 14th of that year, there were even plans made to bomb a postal sorting office in Coventry, something that would have no doubt led to the death of dozens had it gone off as hoped. Thankfully, however, it didn't, though it did directly result in the death of the man who was supposed to plant the explosives, 28-year-old James McDade, and the reason it led to him and him alone dying was because the bomb he was set to deliver that afternoon went off early. Of course, to the UK government, that represented a curious problem as they now had a dead member of the IRA on their hands. One whom the sect of the Republican movement based in England wanted to bury in McDade's home city of Birmingham. But understanding that the public sentiment towards the Provisional Irish Republican Army was extremely negative and that such a funeral, as well as any associated sympathy marches, would likely lead to further violence breaking out, they decided to veto it and demand McDade instead be taken to Ireland to be put to rest. On November 21st of that year, the body of the Republican loyalist was flown directly from Birmingham to Dublin, and then from there driven across the Northern Irish border to Belfast. Why hadn't he just been taken straight there by plane? Well, after learning who was in the coffin, staff at Belfast Airport had outright refused to handle it. Obviously, that created even higher tensions once the news became public knowledge, especially within the Birmingham sect of the IRA, as to them, James McDade had been a blood brother and loyal fighter for the cause. So, in response to the growing unease and the threat of violence it left behind in its wake, all police leave scheduled within the English city for that day was cancelled, and an additional 1,300 officers were drafted in from outside to help quell any potential unrest that was on the verge of bubbling over. But for as much as it was hoped that would do the job and stop any trouble from breaking out, disaster struck anyway, as that evening 2 bombs placed within local pubs Mulberry Bush and Tavern in the Town exploded, killing 21 people and injuring a further 182. It was a complete disaster and one of the worst terrorist attacks the UK had seen take place on its soil up to that point in terms of sheer body count. But it could have been even worse, because originally a 3rd bomb was also supposed to detonate that evening, with that one being positioned outside of Barclays Bank on Hagley Road. Thankfully, before it was set to blow, it was discovered by a police officer who then managed to alert the bomb squad. That said, while it was good news for anyone on Hagley Road who could have been another potential victim, it did little to ease the pain of those at the locations where the other 2 explosions had caused so much chaos. And their pain was worsened all the more by the fact they came so very close to also getting out unscathed in the end. That's right, as was supposed to be the standard procedure for the IRA and bombing plans. The men who'd planted the bombs had then called police from anonymous phone booths in order to warn them of what was coming so that they'd have enough time to evacuate the buildings. Unfortunately, because the initial booths they went to had been vandalized beyond repair, they were forced to find alternative phones to call from instead, something that ultimately shortened the time span law enforcement had to act upon their warnings. That's what led to them arriving late to Mulberry Bush, a pub that was located on the lower 2 floors of a 25-story office block named the Rotunda. By the time they got there, they only had a matter of seconds to get people out. And that meant that when the bomb went off at 8:17 p.m., just 6 minutes after the telephone call warning the cops had been made, 10 people would be killed and dozens would be injured in the subsequent blast, which not only blew a 40-inch or 1-meter crater in the concrete floor of the bar, but also collapsed part of the roof and sent shards of broken glass from the windows flying out into the street beyond. Needless to say then, those that survived the initial explosion were left in absolute shock afterwards as they struggled to wrap their heads around what had just happened. But then why wouldn't they? Because as their eyes gradually focused in on the scene that was playing out in front of them, they were forced to gaze upon bodies impaled by wooden furniture, clothes which had been scorched from human flesh, and what one person later described as a screaming torso writhing around on the floor. So you'd think that once paramedics and firefighters arrived, they'd want to keep things cordoned off from public view. But that wasn't the case as it turned out. No, in a surprising move, at least one member of the emergency services begged police to allow television cameras into the blown-out husk of what had once been Mulberry Bush. According to the first responder, he wanted the IRA to witness the consequences of their actions, forcing them to reckon with whether or not what they were doing was worth all this needless death. In the end, though, law enforcement denied the request as they worried it would lead to even more extreme reprisals from members of the British public. Of course, they were probably right in doing so, as had that footage been shown on the evening news, people would have understandably been outraged. They were disgusted enough when they simply heard about it, and they were even more disgusted when news of the second bombing at Tavern in the Town came to their attention as well, with that one happening just 10 minutes later after the police were given just as little forewarning as before. As had happened with the perpetrator behind the Mulberry Bush detonation, the man who'd planted the explosives at Tavern in the Town had also been forced to find an alternative means of contacting the authorities, meaning they had little time to act on his warning. And because of that, once they reached the basement pub located on New Street, just a short walk away from the Rotunda, they weren't able to evacuate the place in time before it went up in a ball of flames too. So when the bomb detonated, a further 9 people would be killed instantly, with 2 more dying of their injuries over the days that followed. As if that wasn't enough, dozens more were severely injured in a blast so powerful that several revelers were reportedly blown right through a brick wall. So bad was it, in fact, that the way it was described by Brian Yates, one of the first officers on the scene following the explosion, dead bodies had been stacked on top of each other and severed limbs were left lying all over the place. all as the screaming survivors staggered aimlessly through the rubble, attempting to regain their bearings. And to make matters worse, at least initially, rescue efforts to get those still alive out were made very difficult on account of the fact the bomb had been placed at the base of the stairs outside, making gaining access to the wreckage of the bar near impossible. That said, eventually the debris was able to be cleared away enough to where first responders could get in and begin attending to the wounded. And as they did, police started evacuating all other pubs and businesses in Birmingham's city center over fears further bombs were laying in wait, ready to be detonated. On top of evacuating pubs and businesses, all buses headed into the city were halted and taxi drivers in the area were encouraged to stop taking fares and instead transport the wounded to either one of the nearby hospitals in the area or the city center hotel, which at that point had been specifically commandeered for use as an impromptu first aid post. And it was most certainly needed for that purpose because with the number of injured now reaching 182, hospitals simply didn't have enough room to treat everyone. Even if they did, it would have still been a tall task making sure everyone had the care they needed, as many were left permanently disabled as a result of their injuries. One young man would actually have both of his legs amputated, and another young woman was left blind on account of shrapnel that had flown into her eyes. As for the dead, well, that was even more tragic because amongst them were a young couple on a first date and a man who was planning to propose to his girlfriend that evening. Also in attendance was an 18-year-old woman who'd only entered the tavern in the town only moments before the bomb detonated. Obviously, once the dust settled and the people of Birmingham had a chance to fully process what had happened, there was a demand for answers. But while most assumed it was the IRA that was responsible given both the climate of the time and the men who were soon to be arrested in suspicion of the crime, the official line from Rory O'Brien, then president of Sinn Féin, was that they had no involvement. Still though, that wouldn't stop an increase in anti-Irish sentiment growing within the city over the days and weeks that followed, with many Irish people being completely ostracized from public places and finding themselves subject to both physical and verbal abuse. Even Irish-owned businesses wouldn't be safe as many of them were attacked. As if that wasn't bad enough, workers at airports all around England outright refused to handle flights going to the Emerald Isle. But that wasn't all, because in a move made by Home Secretary Roy Jenkins 4 days after the bombings, the Prevention of Terrorism Act of 1974 would formally be introduced. While the goal of that was to try and help make sure something on such a scale never happened again, it was nevertheless criticized by many at the time as being too draconian in its nature, as it allowed anyone merely suspected of being associated with the IRA to be held in custody for up to 7 days without any chance of release. Clearly the UK government had been spooked by what took place in Birmingham. So spooked that they even briefly considered reintroducing the death penalty for use on the suspects if and when they were convicted. But while that suggestion was ultimately shot down as being a step too far, there was still a sense that the people responsible were going to have to be punished to the most severe level the law would allow. And that was where the Birmingham Six came into the story. They were 6 men who originally hailed from Northern Ireland, but who had since moved to the north of England and now found themselves as the prime suspects in the Birmingham pub bombings. And the reason they were considered such was because in the minutes following the 2 explosions, 5 of them had purchased a train ticket to the coastal village of Heysham, somewhere which was to be their last stop before then boarding a ferry to Belfast. Why were they so eager to make it to Belfast? That was the question the police had as, while all 5 would later deny they had any IRA affiliations, the very fact they were Irish and had seemingly left Birmingham in such a hurry that night meant they were quickly deemed to be persons of interest. That was why, after a suspicious booking clerk at Birmingham New Street train station reported them to the authorities, they were each stopped at Heysham Port before they could board a ferry and would from there be taken to Morecambe Police Station to undergo forensic tests. At that location, investigators were able to determine with a 99% degree of certainty that at least 2 of them, Patrick Hill and William Power, had recently handled explosives. As for the other 3, however, John Walker, Gerard Hunter, and Richard McKilkenny, the results of their tests were less conclusive. Still, that didn't mean they hadn't had some involvement in what took place at Mulberry Bush and Tavern in the town, a feeling that was only further emphasized once it became apparent all 5 men had been planning to head back to Belfast in order to attend the funeral of James McDade. Clearly, despite their prior protests, they did have some kind of affiliation with the IRA, even if it was only a passing one, and that, combined with the forensic evidence that had been collected, led to all of them being arrested immediately thereafter. But that wasn't the end of the police's job. No, while they might have had the main suspects in custody, they still hadn't proven their guilt. To do that, they'd have to either find conclusive evidence of their involvement or extract confessions from them, something that wouldn't be easy. That's why, over the next few hours, officers at Morecambe Police Station interrogated each man individually, and when they refused to talk, physical beatings were administered, with the investigators taking great care at that point to avoid leaving any markings on their faces. What they did instead was deliver body kicks, deny the men sleep, drag them by their hair across the floor, then burn them with lit cigarettes, all in the hopes it would get them to admit they were the guilty parties. In the end, while it was certainly a morally questionable method, it appeared to have the desired effect, as at 12:55 p.m. the following afternoon, William Power signed a confession admitting his involvement in the Birmingham pub bombings, with the other 4 following suit not long afterwards. So, with the attackers seemingly caught, they were transferred over to the custody of the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. Meanwhile, as they were doing that, a 6th man who'd been implicated during the confessions, Hugh Callahan, was also arrested at his home that same evening. After being beaten during his own interrogation, he also eventually confessed to being part of an IRA conspiracy to plant bombs at the 2 pubs which had been hit. Obviously then, that made the upcoming trial a mere formality, as it was a matter of record the Birmingham 6 had done it. All that was left to do was officially convict and sentence them. And that process began on June 9, 1975 at Lancaster Crown Court, where all 6 were charged with 21 counts of murder, with additional charges of conspiracy to cause explosions placed on top of those. Interestingly, though, despite their prior confessions, each of the defendants would plead their innocence, with each of them claiming to have never known James McDade or have any allegiance to the Provisional Irish Republican Army. The only reason they'd confessed at all in the first place, as they claimed now, was because they'd been coerced into doing so by the police after being beaten to a pulp for hours. Unfortunately for them, those claims did little good in the end, because even after the validity of the forensic tests linking them to the bombs was brought into question, they were still found guilty 45 days later and from there sentenced to life imprisonment, meaning the only option they had left was to try and appeal the decision and hope that a future judge would see things differently. Would that work? No, at least not right away, because with public sentiment still so strongly against them, the Birmingham 6 found that any of their attempts to redress the court's decision would be denied during the initial months and years that followed. Even when Patrick Hill went on a hunger strike in 1981, nothing changed. In fact, it wasn't until 1987, 2 years after an episode of the news program World in Action shone new light on the inconsistencies of the prosecution's case, that they were finally granted an appeal. Thankfully for them, it was during that appeal that the court was forced to agree that the forensic evidence that had been used to gain a conviction was flawed, to say the least. On top of that, the confessions they'd given couldn't be presented in court as they'd been signed under duress. So that was why, on August 29, 1990, Lord Justice Lloyd chose to overturn the original convictions, setting the Birmingham 6 free for the first time in a decade and a half in the process. Surprisingly, that news was received pretty well by the general public, because by that point, it was apparent to them that the wrongfully convicted men had never been guilty, or at least that the evidence had been nowhere near strong enough to suggest they were. But that still left the question, who was behind the Birmingham pub bombings? And as it happens, that's still a question being asked today. Sure, we do now have confirmation the IRA were responsible, but as to who the specific individuals who planted the bombs were, that remains unclear. Even an official public inquest carried out by West Midlands Police in 1994 came no closer to reaching a conclusion. While such a fact may be frustrating, at the very least the British public has no reason to fear similar attacks taking place again as with the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. Peace was finally reached in Ireland once more. Will this peace last forever? We can only hope so, because if conflict were ever to break out again, who knows what further damage could be done to the innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Whether that be those who die as a result of the fighting, or those who are wrongfully accused of doing the killing and have their lives ruined as a result. At the end of the day, even if you're not involved in the battle, just make sure you remain vigilant, because you never know when your own home will become a battlefield. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.